Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world of candlelight, crumbling stone castles, and courtly whispers, where love letters are sung not spoken, and passion is tangled in parchment rules thicker than the soup at a monastery. You're wearing hose, your breath smells faintly of mead, and you're trying to woo a noblewoman who's only allowed to glance at you twice a fortnight, if you're lucky. Tonight's journey unwraps the most bizarre, peculiar, and occasionally sweet rituals of medieval love. But a fair warning, you probably won't survive this. Between the rigid codes, holy guilt, and love poetry that sounds suspiciously like passive-aggressive threats, medieval romance might just be the least relaxing way to fall in love or fall asleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where my sleepy historians are tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit beside a flickering fire in the corner of a smoky great hall. A minstrel strums a lute, his voice wobbling through a verse so drenched in metaphor, it takes you a moment to realize he's talking about someone's ankle. Apparently, in the age of chivalry, showing an ankle was on par with flashing a forbidden scroll of state secrets. Welcome to courtly love, the most dramatic slow burn in history. Your crush isn't someone you can simply talk to. No, you must write them a poem in Latin, send it via a page boy who may or may not be literate, and await a reply that arrives 3 weeks later in the form of a dried flower and an indirect gaze from across the courtyard. Oh, and she's married to a man 3 times her age. But that's fine, because in the game of courtly love, actual consummation is considered rather gauche. Historians still argue whether this entire tradition was a real social practice or more of a literary fantasy crafted by bored French poets with too much parchment and too few dates. But what we do know is that by the 12th century, troubadours were composing elaborate love codes that prescribed everything from the proper number of love sighs per day, 3, to how much jealousy was ideal. Just enough to inspire poetry, but not enough to start a duel. These romantic rituals were especially rampant in the courts of southern France and northern Italy. Women, particularly noblewomen, held more sway than you'd expect. They could judge poetry contests, assign penalties for bad rhymes, and even give out decorative tokens like sleeves or gloves to favored suitors. Basically, they were running a medieval version of The Bachelor, except instead of roses, it was embroidered garters. And instead of dramatic eliminations, you got excommunicated. You wander through the garden maze of a castle's inner court, dodging knights who are practicing their love laments like they're auditioning for a Gregorian boy band. A lanky squire offers you a pomegranate, which turns out to be symbolic of fertility. You thank him awkwardly and move on. Not everyone was thrilled with this melodramatic genre of affection. The church raised an eyebrow well, a whole skeptical brow ridge, while it appreciated the lack of physical contact. It deeply disliked the elevation of romantic obsession above spiritual devotion. Monks warned that fixating on a lady's favor could endanger the soul. Then again, so could sneezing without crossing yourself. Still, even the nobility leaned into it. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, famously held courts of love, where noblewomen debated the finer points of romantic etiquette. Should a knight pursue a married lady? Yes, but respectfully. What if she rejects him? He must suffer poetically. Should women be flattered by flattery? Only if it's clever, and so on. One quirky tidbit, the rules of courtly love, were often compiled into lists, like Andreas Capellanus's De Amore, which outlines 31 strange rules, including a new love puts to flight an old one, and jealousy increases love. Basically, medieval clickbait. You curl up beneath a heavy wool blanket, the scent of beeswax, and smoke in the air. Somewhere nearby, a poet cries softly into a goblet of diluted wine. You drift toward dreams, wondering how anyone had the patience for this much emotional buildup, just to maybe brush fingertips at a feast. You wake up to the gentle toll of a monastery bell, only to realize it's not Sunday. It's wedding day. Not yours, thankfully, but someone's. And in the medieval world, that's reason enough to put on your second best tunic. Avoid eye contact with anyone you've secretly fancied, and shuffle toward the parish church for a ceremony that is equal parts holy and legally suspicious. Marriage, in theory, is a sacrament. In practice, it's a negotiation, a legal contract, a social strategy, a way to merge goats and grudges across generations. You watch as two people, probably teenagers, stand stiffly before a sweating priest, their hands bound together with a length of ribbon. It's symbolic, but also just good insurance against anyone bolting. Historians still argue whether most medieval weddings were joyfully celebrated or grimly tolerated. There's plenty of evidence for both. Some regions threw week-long feasts. Others whispered the vows under a tree in the middle of nowhere, hoping no one would object. And yes, the church tried to regulate it all, but reality often laughed in Latin. One mainstream fact: you didn't always need a priest. For much of the medieval period, a simple exchange of vows, I take thee, and so do I, spoken in front of witnesses, was enough. No ring, no cake, no awkward DJ, just two souls, one promise, and hopefully a few oxen as a dowry. Now, about that dowry. It's less of a gift and more of a bribe, or a hedge fund. The bride's family usually paid it, not out of generosity, but to make her more marketable. A bigger dowry meant a better husband, or at least a slightly less disinterested one. This led to a lot of teenage girls being traded like barrels of salted fish, which is exactly as romantic as it sounds. You shuffle past a crowd of drunk relatives, yelling about whose turn it is to carry the roast swan. Someone throws flower petals. Someone else throws up. And there, standing near the well, is the new bride, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Medieval marriage laws were famously fuzzy. You could be betrothed at 7, married at 12, and widowed by 16. Consent was technically required, but so was obedience to your parents. If you protested loudly enough, you might delay the wedding. If you ran away, you might get dragged back. And if you eloped without permission, well, let's just say the punishments ranged from mild exorcism to thrown into a nunnery. Fun tidbit: some communities believed that consummation sealed the marriage, not the ceremony. So technically, if two peasants mumbled vows in a hayloft and did the deed, they were married. Legally, spiritually, hayfully, this led to an entire genre of awkward ecclesiastical lawsuits in which someone had to prove they didn't sleep with someone, often in front of a bishop. Truly, the worst kind of public speaking. As you walk through the churchyard, you pass an old stone bench where, according to legend, a couple once wed by moonlight after losing their priest to a rogue boar attack. She wore her best linen. He held a turnip in place of a ring. The town still talks about it. The ceremony ends with a kiss, or more accurately, a squishy forehead nudge, and the crowd erupts into polite applause. Time for the bedding ritual. Oh yes, the bedding ritual. You follow the procession to the newlyweds' chamber, where things are about to get weird. In some regions, it was custom for witnesses, friends, family, sometimes even the priest, to escort the couple to bed. This involved ribald jokes, songs, and occasionally lifting the bed curtains to make sure everything was progressing. It's hard to imagine a more uncomfortable first night of marriage or a worse start to intimacy than surrounded by cheering uncles. You tiptoe away before things get more medieval. Outside, fireflies blink over the church wall, and the stars hang low and heavy, like gossip in a small town. The bride and groom are now bound in holy matrimony, family alliances, and about 6 different social expectations neither fully understands. You lean back against a mossy tree and sigh. Romance in the Middle Ages, you're starting to realize, was less about passion and more about property, duty, and surviving the feast without food poisoning. You wake the next morning to the echo of wooden spoons clinking against pewter bowls, the scent of yesterday's onions still lingering in the air. The wedding is over, but the town's gossip mill is just heating up, especially about whether the bride looked pleased enough during the bedding ceremony. Spoiler alert: no one ever looks pleased when a dozen people are humming lute songs outside the door. Today's breakfast chatter, though, turns to a far more curious artifact: the chastity belt. You've probably heard the stories: metal contraptions, spiked interiors, keys held by jealous husbands riding off to war, a medieval padlock for passion. And while it makes for a shocking museum display or punchline, in a bad Renaissance fair joke. The truth is slippery. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were ever widely used, or if most of them were invented during the Victorian era as a sort of look how uncivilized they were gag. Some belts appear in 16th century engravings, but those may be satire. Others in museums are fakes, cobbled together in the 1800s from curiosity and brass hinges. That said, a few real ones might have existed, mostly symbolic, rarely functional. Imagine a belt not of iron, but of stiffened leather, worn as a reminder, not a prison. You, however, decide not to imagine too hard, because the idea of using medieval metallurgy anywhere near your nether regions is enough to make you clench involuntarily. You walk past the blacksmith's forge, where two apprentices giggle over a drawing that looks suspiciously like a girdle with spikes. Nearby, an old woman hawks love charms made from dried frog tongues, promising fidelity and fewer impure thoughts. It's unclear which is worse, the superstition or the smell. The truth is, medieval folks were obsessed with virginity, but mostly for women. A man's virtue was measured in land, horses, and how often he could recite the Psalms without falling asleep. A woman's, a hymen, a social security system built on the thinnest biological margin possible. One mainstream fact: wedding sheets were sometimes inspected for blood the morning after. No stain, no proof, no proof, no dowry. It's an appalling system, made worse by the fact that biology doesn't always cooperate with medieval expectations. And in cases of dispute, women bore the full shame, while men generally wandered off whistling. Quirky side note: some merchants sold virginity cloths, bits of animal, blood-soaked fabric for those who feared inspection. Whether this was clever survival or entrepreneurial deceit is, again, hotly debated. What's not debated is that you're very glad to live in a time where IKEA sheets aren't subject to peer review. You continue wandering past a nunnery where two sisters hang linens in the sun, their quiet smiles betraying nothing. One hums a tune about Saint Agnes, patroness of chastity, who famously refused marriage and was punished by being sent to a brothel. According to legend, her purity scared off the clients. You nod respectfully at the irony inside the local scriptorium. A monk copies a manuscript detailing the uses and benefits of marital moderation. His margin doodles, however, show a cartoonish devil running off with a chastity belt key. Beneath it, a scribbled note: for temptation comes not through fire, but through the imagination. You make a mental note to return later and see what other marginalia he's been cooking up. The village's younger men, meanwhile, are gathered around a traveling peddler selling locks, keys, and curious leather straps. They laugh, nudge each other, and whisper tales of knights who padlocked their wives before crusading east. You'd roll your eyes if you weren't already doing it internally. In truth, these belts, if ever real, were likely uncomfortable, rarely worn, and mostly symbolic. But the myth of the chastity belt endured because it satisfied a certain image, that of the controlling husband, the passive wife, the perfect patriarchal punchline. Even if the metal never truly chafed thighs, the concept definitely scraped dignity. You pass the town fountain and see a girl reading aloud from a book of courtly love poetry. The language is flowery, the metaphors absurd. A rose is never just a rose. A knight's lance is never just a lance. It's all coded language, sly ways to talk about desire while pretending not to. As the sun rises higher, you step into the shadow of a crumbling stone tower, once used as a prison, now mostly used by bored teens to carve initials and sneak kisses. You sit on a mossy step and let your mind drift. Whether metal or myth, the chastity belt reveals less about medieval women and more about modern obsessions with purity, control, and the spectacle of those weird old times. And as you close your eyes, you can almost hear the clank of imagined keys, unlocking nothing at all. You wake again near the riverbank, where the townsfolk have gathered for the weekly washing of linens. Though if you listen closely, you'll hear more gossip than scrubbing. A group of women slap sheets against stones while whispering about who got caught in whose loft last night, and whether Father Beckett's sermon about cleansing the soul was aimed at Lady Anselma's wandering hands. The conversation turns to a little-known medieval rule called copulation bans during holy days. That's right, depending on where you lived, you were forbidden from doing the deed on Sundays, feast days, fast days, Lent, Advent, Wednesdays, Fridays, and sometimes even during harvest season. At this point, you're thinking, when was anything allowed? Historians still argue whether these bans were strictly enforced or mostly ignored. Like modern no jaywalking signs, they existed more for moral comfort than real punishment. But in theory, breaking these bans could earn you penance, like fasting for 40 days or reciting the Psalms until your knees gave out. Or worse, being forced to confess to a monk who smelled like boiled cabbage and disappointment. Mainstream fact. Church teachings listed over 180 forbidden days for intercourse. And if you did the deed in the wrong position, at the wrong time, or with the wrong intention, that was considered a sin too. The wrong intention part was especially fuzzy and could include things like enjoying yourself too much. Scandalous. Quirky side note, some clergy taught that intercourse on a feast day could result in deformed children, not twins, mind you. That was chalked up to overzealous frequency. You wonder how many babies born with crooked toes got blamed on St. Bartholomew's feast. You head into town and pass a public notice nailed to a post listing appropriate marital behavior. It's written in Latin, of course, which half the villagers can't read, but everyone claims to know by heart. A baker's wife walks by humming a tune about Saint Valentine, then whispers to her friend, "Well, I suppose last night was Tuesday." At the market square, a man in patched robes is selling virginity-restoring herbs, and a potion labeled infallible lust repellent, now with more rue. It smells like burnt moss and regret. As you browse the stalls, you overhear two monks debating whether marital relations are allowed when traveling. One insists it disrupts spiritual focus. The other says it's fine, as long as you don't face east. Neither appears to be married, and both look deeply sleep-deprived. In one shaded alley, you find a scribbled love letter half-tucked into a flower pot. It reads, "Meet me under the old mill wheel. We shall not be bound by feast or fast." A heart is drawn beside it, pierced by what looks suspiciously like a chicken leg. Back in the churchyard, a young couple walks hand in hand, careful not to brush too close in case someone glares disapprovingly. A nearby priest recites morning prayers, throwing in the occasional suspicious glance. His sermon yesterday was about fleshly urges. Today, the theme appears to be walking with restraint. You pause at a carved stone plaque on the chapel wall, listing all the feast days for the local saints. If you took them all seriously, there'd be roughly 3 weeks a year left for marital intimacy. And even those would come with asterisked footnotes about not getting too enthusiastic. You wonder how anyone was ever conceived in medieval Europe. And yet, people were. Constantly. Despite bans, guilt trips, and spicy sermons, the medieval world was full of passion, secrecy, and sly rebellion. Love found cracks in every stone wall. And if rules were broken, well, who was counting? Certainly not the baker's assistant, who just winked at you behind a basket of yeast rolls. You head toward the town's edge, where a young boy is carving little stick figures into the dirt. One tall, one small, one upside down. You ask what he's drawing. He shrugs. My parents said they can't kiss till St. Jerome's Day is over. He giggles and draws another upside-down figure. With a sigh and a stretch, you glance toward the cathedral, its bell ringing out the hour. Another holy day, another invisible wall drawn between people who love each other. But medieval folks were crafty. If they couldn't cross the wall, they went around it, under it, or wrote poems that tiptoed suggestively along the edge, because as every bard and baker knew, desire doesn't care what day it is. You shuffle into the town's apothecary, a low-beamed room thick with incense and dried nettles. Clay jars line the walls, each bearing cryptic labels: powder of unicorn's horn, womb-warming tincture, and something ominously called St. Agnes's Bitter. Behind the counter stands a woman named Beatrix, part healer, part midwife, part gossip collector. She adjusts her coif and eyes you like she already knows why you're here. You're not sick. You're curious. Today's whispered topic: love potions, aphrodisiacs, and cures for excess desire. In the Middle Ages, the line between medicine and magic was thinner than a communion wafer. People believed herbs, stones, prayers, and even animal parts could shape the heart's leanings or stop them cold. One widely used concoction included powdered beetle shells and ashes of dried doves. Another relied on mandrake root, a plant that screams when uprooted. Historians still argue whether that scream was literal or poetic. Mainstream fact: the church condemned these love remedies as dangerous sorcery. But that didn't stop villagers from slipping rosehip syrup into ale or tucking rosemary under mattresses. If it smelled strong, tingled slightly, or tasted like boiled tree bark, it was considered romantic. Beatrix reaches beneath her counter and pulls out a pouch of blessed thistle, murmuring that it keeps a husband loyal and sleepy, whether it works or not. You notice her own husband hasn't left his chair in 3 days. Then there were the cooling herbs, used to quell lustful thoughts, things like lettuce, water lily, and bitter lettuce. Yes, lettuce was considered spiritually numbing. It gives salad a whole new vibe. At a bench near the window, an apprentice stirs a bubbling cauldron of thick paste. He mutters measurements while scratching notes on a scroll titled Essence of Chastity. You lean closer and realize the ingredients include chalk, vinegar, and dried moss from a monk's sandals. Not every potion was subtle. Some were designed to repel would-be lovers entirely. A popular mixture contained garlic, crushed fish bones, and goose grease, essentially turning its wearer into a walking do not disturb sign. Quirky tidbit: some medieval texts warned that applying aphrodisiac ointments too generously could cause stubborn arousal of the loins, lasting 3 days or more. One cautionary tale involves a knight who accidentally smeared passion balm on his saddle and couldn't sit properly until Pentecost. Outside the apothecary, you follow a trail of crushed herbs to a market stall where a traveling merchant offers exotic elixirs. He claims one bottle contains Venetian sea milk, guaranteed to restore marital spark. You peer inside and see something floating. It might be seaweed. It might not. A matron with 7 children haggles over a different potion, this one said to cause complete romantic disinterest for at least a fortnight. She says she needs the break. The merchant nods solemnly and wraps the bottle in cloth printed with hearts. Over by the chapel garden, a nun quietly tends to fennel and anise. She insists there for soup, but a knowing glance passes between her and Beatrix. Even cloisters had their own herbal secrets. You meander past a young scribe copying a tract by Hildegard of Bingen, who claimed certain herbs quiet the humors and sweeten the body's urges. He stops to sharpen his quill, then doodles a little heart beside a stick figure. Apparently, even monks in training aren't immune. Historians still argue whether love potions ever worked or were simply rituals of hope. Maybe they were placebos. Maybe they were magic. Or maybe they were just the medieval way of saying, I like you, and I'm willing to drink something weird to prove it. As twilight gathers, you pass a wooden bench where 2 teens sit awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. The boy holds a small cloth sachet of alluring powder. He drops it. The girl steps on it. They both blush and pretend not to notice. You keep walking. The world smells of lavender and boiled onions, and somewhere a lute plays a slightly off-key melody about enchanted kisses and long-lost lovers. You think of Beatrix again, how she winked and said, "A potion is only half the magic." The rest, it seems, was always in the asking. You tiptoe through the hushed stone halls of a monastery just before dawn, your footsteps muffled by ancient rugs and spiritual dread. Here, amidst solemn chants and strict vows of celibacy, a different kind of desire simmers quietly beneath starched habits and flickering candlelight. Yes, tonight, we're peeking into the forbidden world of medieval monks and nuns, their secret longings, their baffling rules, and the many ways they bent them like reeds in the wind. Officially, of course, chastity was everything. Monks were supposed to live like angels, earthbound, but unsullied. Nuns, too, devoted themselves to purity, their bodies offered to Christ alone, but historians still argue whether these vows were kept as strictly as parchment scrolls would have us believe. Take Brother Matthew, for instance. Legend says he fell in love with Sister Beatrice across the scriptorium. Their eyes met over illuminated margins and flourished capital letters. They began leaving each other messages, sweet nothings hidden in Latin verses, and hand-pressed flower petals tucked into psalm books. Quirky tidbit: a 13th century abbot once complained in writing that the sisters giggle too loudly during Vespers and are seen walking with roses behind their ears. Either someone was gardening, or love was definitely in bloom. Inside the cloister kitchen, a nun with flushed cheeks accidentally knocks over a basket of apples. A monk rushes to help. They share a look, then stare at the ground for a solid minute. You feel like an intruder in a Jane Austen novel with Gregorian soundtrack. It wasn't just side glances and poetry. Secret tunnels were rumored to connect male and female quarters. One chronicle speaks of a monk who disguised himself as a nun for 6 months just to be close to the object of his affection. Eventually, the beard gave him away. Mainstream fact, despite strict church regulations, some monasteries had shockingly lax oversight. Bishops would issue visits, sure, but often announced them well in advance, which meant time to hide love letters, perfume bottles, and the occasional lipstick made from crushed beetroot. You wander deeper into the scriptorium, where monks copy texts by candlelight. One manuscript shows signs of editing lines about divine longing, suspiciously close to poetry about a woman with golden hair. The ink changes color halfway through. At a convent in France, Sister Claire reportedly kept a diary detailing dreams about the Archangel Gabriel that bordered on the scandalous. The church deemed them visions. The rest of us might call it romantic fanfiction. Out in the herb garden, a novice nun grinds mint and marjoram while humming softly. You overhear an older sister whisper, "That one dreams too vividly." You're not sure if that's a compliment. Even theology was occasionally weaponized for flirting. One monk famously asked a nun if she'd like to debate the Song of Songs, possibly the steamiest book in the Bible. She agreed, and their meetings stretched long into the night. Still, fear was never far. The threat of punishment loomed large: public confession, exile to harsher abbeys, or even imprisonment in a cell barely wider than a coffin. Yet still they whispered. Still they longed. Sometimes longing took stranger forms. A monk in Italy reportedly developed a fixation on a statue of the Virgin Mary. He was moved to tears during every prayer until the abbot removed the statue and replaced it with something less distracting. There were rules for everything: where you could walk, what time you prayed, how long you bathed. But there were no rules for what dreams did in the quiet dark, or how two hearts might brush against each other through layers of woolen robes and holy fear. You pass a dormitory now. Rows of beds, each with a single candle flickering beside it. You can almost hear the breath of monks sleeping beneath thick blankets, perhaps dreaming of nothing, or perhaps of someone they'll never name aloud. A raven croaks from the window ledge. Mornings close. You slip outside through the garden gate, your mind swimming with secrets and psalms. In a world ruled by vows, the human heart, it seems, still kept its own commandments. You find yourself in the great hall of a minor noble's manor, just as the long oak table is being cleared of breakfast trenchers, and the maid begins dusting tapestries embroidered with battle scenes and saints. Except the saints look suspiciously flushed, and one is missing a sandal. Today, we're diving into the realm of trial by betting, and the strange ways medieval people tried to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, whether a marriage was legitimate, consummated, or cursed by barren fate. It starts with an awkward ceremony, the betting ritual. Newlyweds didn't just scurry off alone with a bottle of mead. No, they were escorted to the marriage bed by a chorus of family members, servants, and sometimes clergy. Everyone sang bawdy songs. The bride's shoes might be stolen as a prank. The groom's breeches might be jokingly inspected. Standard romantic atmosphere. Mainstream fact: public betting ceremonies were common across Europe, especially among the nobility. They symbolized the official start of a marriage and made it extremely difficult to later claim the union hadn't been consummated. Quirky tidbit: in some regions, a designated witness was assigned to sit behind a curtain or even peek through a hole in the wall. One particularly nosy baron supposedly wrote a short poem about what he overheard. Historians still argue whether it was a love poem or performance review. If conception failed after a few moons, things got complicated. Cue the trial by betting. The couple might be examined by midwives, priests, or even a jury of elders. They would be asked questions, some anatomical, others deeply invasive. Occasionally, both husband and wife were stripped and physically examined for signs of coldness narrowness, or inward dryness. Don't worry, it was all done in the name of science. Scholars still argue whether these trials were more spectacle than science. After all, fertility was mysterious in the Middle Ages. If someone was barren, it might be the devil, poor humors, or moonlight. One chronicler even blamed a lack of freckles. You walk into a room hung with faded green curtains where a priest is pacing nervously while holding a feather quill. He is about to record the testimony of a couple who have been, failing to meet expectations. The couple sits side by side, red-faced and silent. You shuffle past quickly. In one castle, a noblewoman was made to drink a potion of parsley, goose grease, and powdered pearl to restore fertility. The side effect, uncontrollable hiccups during Mass. Meanwhile, the man might be given wine steeped with crushed ants, or asked to sleep under a fleece blanket soaked in rosemary. If the herbs failed, they sometimes blamed witchcraft. It was the catch-all excuse of the era. Can't perform, probably cursed. Sometimes the law took matters further. If a man could not fulfill his duties, his wife might sue for annulment. But first, she had to prove he was physically incapable. Enter the trial by Congress. A team of physicians would examine him. Occasionally, they would ask him to demonstrate his natural function in front of them. That's one way to get stage fright. You pass through a tiny courtroom where an accused husband clutches a sheepskin for modesty, while 5 bearded men argue about his performance. His mother-in-law knits silently in the corner. This is not his best day. Sometimes, couples who passed the trial were given symbolic rewards, like fruit baskets. One German town offered pears and a leather glove as proof of fruitful union. You can't make this up. Not every trial ended in humiliation. Occasionally, love won out. A particularly nervous groom once fainted during the bedding ceremony. The bride kissed his forehead, wrapped him in a woolen cloak, and whispered, "We'll try again tomorrow." Years later, they had 7 children and ran a cheese stall together. You pause at a stone basin outside the manor. A young woman is washing her hands, glancing at the reflection of a man in the window. She smiles. You sense that in this world of public scrutiny and whispered judgments, private kindness still matters. The fire in the hearth crackles. Another trial concludes. Another parchment is signed. Another couple carries both shame and relief in equal measure. You tip your head back and look up at the wooden beams above, wondering how many strange verdicts they've echoed and whether some things love, desire, hope can ever truly be measured with law and leeches. You're now walking along a winding village lane just before dusk, your boots crunching over dried thistle and last week's spilled barley. 2 boys giggle as they race past, trailing behind them a stolen goose feather and a smudged love note. It's addressed to Maud with the crooked smile. Scandalous already. Tonight, we're slipping into the tangled legal haystack of sumptuary laws. Those peculiar rules that told people not just how to behave in bed, but how to dress for it, or more accurately, how not to dress in ways that might tempt others to misbehave. In theory, sumptuary laws were about social order. In practice, they were a combination of fashion policing and moral micromanagement. If you were a milkmaid with a particularly eye-catching bodice, you might get fined. A merchant's wife flaunting imported silk ribbons, public shaming. A tailor accused of inserting too much lift in a gentleman's hose. Don't even ask. Mainstream fact. Throughout medieval Europe, especially in England and France, governments issued long lists of forbidden fabrics, colors, and accessories based on social rank and supposed morality. Fringe tidbit: one law in Florence banned jewel-studded garters because they allegedly drew attention to the thighs, an area deemed incendiary to the Christian eye. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely about piety or just a way to stop the lower classes from looking fabulous. You pause at a wooden post near the market square. A parchment notice flutters there, declaring, "Henceforth, no married woman shall wear a crimson hood unless her husband hath lands beyond the river." You chuckle. Who checks the river boundary? In one sleepy village, a priest was fined for wearing fur-lined gloves outside of frost season. Not because he was warm, but because the gloves were dyed saffron, and only nobility could wear saffron. And if you think that's strict, wait till you hear about button counts. Some towns regulated how many buttons you could wear. Too many meant you were calling lust with metal eyes. But the weirdest rules, those reserved for wedding nights. In parts of Germany, brides were forbidden from wearing red ribbons during the ceremony, because red, as every medieval person knew, was the color of temptation, menstruation, and demonic temptation, all rolled into one. And in London, a 14th century edict banned lacework from being too sheer over the chest. The term used, breast-like clearness. It's hard to say that phrase without laughing or blushing. You glance into a small tailor's shop. A woman is being fitted for a velvet gown. Her daughter hides under the table, stitching a secret pocket, perhaps to hide contraband buttons or love letters. One case from a Burgundian court records a man accused of excessive codpiece enhancement. He was fined 3 goats and told to wear sackcloth for a fortnight. Apparently, his neighbors found it distracting during Sunday Mass. Scholars still argue whether these laws were genuinely enforced or mostly ignored. After all, who could keep track of which shoelace belonged to which class? Some towns tried harder than others. In parts of Spain, roving modesty patrols inspected taverns and churches, noting who wore feathers, gold thread, or silk stockings. If you were caught in something forbidden, the punishment might be mild, like reciting extra prayers, or bizarre, like standing barefoot in the square, holding the offending garment. One woman in Rouen was punished for wearing a temptress hat. Don't ask, by being forced to walk backward around the market, singing a psalm. Apparently, It didn't work. She later eloped with the baker. You pass a traveling puppet show in the village square. The marionettes reenact a love story between a weaver's daughter and a nobleman who pretends to be a tanner. The punchline: he's revealed by his illegally luxurious cloak lining. The children laugh. Their parents sigh. Fashion still ruins everything. Despite all the restrictions, people found ways to flirt with fabric. Hidden ribbons, mismatched stockings, double-stitched seams that only revealed their shimmer under candlelight. You wander past a drying line where a crimson petticoat flutters in the breeze. Forbidden, possibly. Fabulous, absolutely. And as you tuck your cloak tighter and move on, you realize no law, no matter how fussy, can truly ban beauty or desire, or a really well-cut hose. You rise before dawn again, this time waking in the drafty loft of a timber-framed tavern. The bed smells faintly of ale, time, and last night's regrets. Outside, roosters sound the alarm, and you groggily remember you've agreed to help sweep the chapel floor today. Penance for that thing you said about the bishop's beard. Today, we ease into the weird world of chastity belts, those infamous metal contraptions supposedly clamped onto women to keep virtue sealed like a pickle jar. Are they real? Were they used? Or are they just a spicy Renaissance prank? First, the mainstream truth. Chastity belts did exist in art and poetry and museum curiosities, but whether they were seriously worn for extended periods is highly debatable. Most scholars argue they were either metaphorical warnings, fetish objects, or the medieval version of satirical meme content. Just, in bronze. One Italian manuscript features a knight gifting his wife a key before heading to war, saying, "Guard thy garden well." She responds with a wink. Was this romance or satire? Historians still argue whether these texts depict truth or jest. But some belts were constructed likely in the Renaissance era. These had small, cruel slits, weirdly polished interiors, and padlocks fit for a stable door. Were they for real-life use? Probably not, unless someone really wanted to die of rust. A fringe tidbit: one 15th century belt found in Austria had an inscription that read, "If love be true, let none pass through." Sweet, uncomfortable, possibly just a wedding gag gift. You step into the chapel's side corridor. A low fresco shows St. Agnes, patron of chastity, flanked by lambs. You think they look judgmental. A monk walks past carrying a basket of pears. He offers you one with a grin that suggests he's never read the belt chapter of Leviticus. In reality, enforcing chastity had less to do with iron and more to do with community surveillance. If a woman so much as smiled at a foreign merchant too long, the gossips would descend like crows. Many villages had watch widows, older women paid to spy on unmarried girls. Imagine your entire romantic life supervised by nosy grandmothers in woolen shawls. Some towns even employed morality men. Think beat cops with candles, who would knock on doors after curfew to ensure no unauthorized fraternization was happening. The penalties ranged from public scolding to mandatory cold baths, or, in a few cases, being forced to wear a symbolic lock around your neck. You pass a young girl scrubbing steps, humming a love ballad. Her sister whispers warnings, "You'll bring shame." But the tune continues, lilting and defiant. One record from Bohemia describes a father who allegedly forged a wooden chastity frame with barbed wire. His daughter escaped on a hay cart, became a tavern singer, and later married a magistrate. So much for barbed parenting. The idea of enforced abstinence through machinery also made its way into jokes. In one English farce, a blacksmith makes a belt so tight the husband loses the key and hires a locksmith. The play ends with 3 men in the bushes and a midwife holding a crowbar. And then there's the tale of Marjorie the Clever, who reportedly crafted a false belt from painted leather. Her lover, a shepherd with small hands and a taste for pickled onions. No further details exist, but you can imagine the smell. Chastity, it seems, was more performance than prison. The real belts were shame, custom, and gossip. And even those couldn't lock down the human heart for long. You peek behind the altar. There's an iron ring set into the stone, a leftover from some forgotten ritual. Or perhaps the place village scolds were chained for loose speech, a relic of discipline, or just a misunderstood plumbing fixture. As the bell tolls for morning mass, you step out into the light. A boy ties a ribbon on a girl's sleeve, public, symbolic, and utterly unbelted. She grins. He trips over a chicken. So much for control. You follow the road away from the chapel, where muddy hoofprints mark the path, and a breeze carries the scent of cider and damp wool. The village begins to stir, merchants hoisting shutters, dogs barking at carts, and somewhere, a pig squealing like it's seen the tax man. Your next stop is the fairground. Not for fun, necessarily, but because you've heard rumors of a traveling morality play being performed today. And where there are morality plays, there are usually side whispers of the church's role in sex education or miseducation, depending on how you squint at it. Now, it's tempting to think of medieval priests as purely fire and brimstone types. But in truth, they were also some of the era's only official sex educators. That said, their lessons were, let's just call them creatively incomplete. A standard confession manual from the 14th century instructed priests to question parishioners about the exact positions they used during intercourse. Yes, really, because some were considered more sinful than others. Missionary, fine. Anything else? Better sit through a sermon. You spot a friar near the puppet booth, handing out illustrated leaflets on moral living. One side shows Adam and Eve, the other is surprisingly detailed. You fold it discreetly and keep walking. One mainstream fact: sex within marriage was not only permitted, but expected. In fact, refusal without just cause was grounds for annulment. There's even documentation of court cases where spouses sued each other for failure to perform marital duty. These hearings included some very awkward public testimonies and occasionally witness statements from household staff. "Yes, Your Honor, I heard no groaning that night." A fringe tidbit: the church classified Wednesdays, Fridays, and most feast days as off-limits for intimacy. Add in Lent, Advent, and Saint holidays, and you're left with a handful of approved dates per year. Imagine needing a calendar and a confessor just to get cozy. Historians still argue whether priests truly enforced these bans or simply used them as rhetorical tools. Records suggest that in smaller villages, priests were more lenient, turning a blind eye as long as the villagers showed up for Mass and didn't birth children named Bacchus. Meanwhile, the morality play begins. A painted devil dances across the makeshift stage, waving a giant sausage and chasing a nun with papier-mâché wings. Children laugh. A grandmother rolls her eyes. The nun hits the devil with a wooden spoon, and everyone claps. It's a parody, of course, but laced with truth. Medieval culture often used absurdity to process taboos. Many plays mocked lust as a foolish impulse, but underneath, the humor was a coded warning. Desire unchecked could doom the soul. Also, apparently, it made you vulnerable to flying sausages. Behind the booth, a group of nuns sells honey cakes shaped like lilies, symbols of purity. Though one of them winks when you ask for a second. Was that an indulgence or an invitation? Elsewhere, monks compiled guides like the De Secretis Mulierum on the secrets of women, which was part medical textbook, part ecclesiastical guesswork, and part complete nonsense. It claimed, among other things, that a woman's womb wandered her body, and that too much desire could make a man's bones melt. Still, some clergy did attempt genuine compassion. Certain abbots wrote about the importance of mutual affection, even pleasure, in Christian unions. Of course, these ideas didn't exactly make the bestseller list. You pass two scholars arguing over whether marital love counted as a sin if it felt too good. One gestures to the clouds, the other to his own loins. Neither seems to win the debate. Even artwork in churches carried double meanings. One stained glass window in York, now mostly lost to time, allegedly depicted a tree of temptation, with apples in suggestive clusters, and a snake that looked suspiciously like it was enjoying itself. But perhaps the strangest ecclesiastical notion was that pleasure could only be holy if you tried not to enjoy it. So long as you grimaced, squinted at the ceiling beams, and muttered prayers mid-act, all was well. Smiling, that meant penance. The morality play ends with a peasant chasing the devil off stage using a leek. The crowd cheers. Somewhere, a bishop frowns. You take your honey cakes and leave mind spinning with contradictions. The church was a guardian of virtue, a teacher of shame, a reluctant guide, and at times, a silent enabler. Sex they taught was sacred, but only if you performed it like a tax audit. Back on the path, the breeze carries birdsong and distant laughter. A couple walks ahead, fingers grazing, eyes darting toward the woods. You smile. Let them have their moment. It's not a feast day. You turn your feet toward the village edge, where the cottages grow fewer and the trees grow braver. It's quieter here, the clamor of bells and market gossip fading into birdsong, and the occasional creak of a shutter swinging lazily in the wind. You're heading to the washerwoman's hut, not for laundry, but for scandal. Because this is where stories accumulate like soot in a chimney. And one story in particular bubbles up, the tale of ritual purification after illicit intimacy. Now, purification in the Middle Ages didn't mean a hot bath and essential oils. For one, hot baths were rare, and essential oils were more pig fat and dried lavender. But what's striking is how many layers of superstition, herbal remedies, and even magical thinking surrounded the aftercare of sex, especially the forbidden kind. One mainstream fact: certain penitential manuals recommended physical penance for sexual acts deemed sinful, even within marriage. A common remedy was bread and water, fasting for up to 40 days. That's 40 days of gnawing crust and burping barley water, because you dared to enjoy your spouse's company too enthusiastically. Inside the washerwoman's hut, bundles of damp linen hang from low beams. A copper kettle steams over the fire, perfumed with rosemary and mugwort, herbs once believed to cool the passions. You step over a basin filled with cloudy water, and a cat hisses at your boots, clearly judging your moral compass. A fringe tidbit: some villagers believed that standing on a frog postact, yes, an actual frog, would draw out fiery humors from the loins. One text describes a woman tying goose feathers to her thighs, hoping to shiver off desire. Goosebumps, it seems, were a cure. Historians still argue whether these customs were widespread or isolated oddities. Records suggest variation across regions. What one town deemed protective, another deemed witchcraft. Either way, frogs lived nervously. You move to the back garden, where laundry flaps like gossip. An older woman shows you a moon cloth, a square of crimson wool placed beneath the bed to absorb sinful energy. According to legend, it needed to be burned at dawn, else you'd dream of succubi. She also describes how some lovers confessed in advance, hoping for pre-forgiveness, like medieval indulgences for the heart. I'll be sorry tomorrow, Father, but not tonight. Risky business, that. You notice a curious item hanging from a peg, a carved wooden phallus, polished smooth. Not a toy, but a symbol of cleansing used in certain women's rituals to ward off lustful spirits. One version even had Latin inscriptions warning demons to stay away or face eternal flatulence. Bold. Another oddity: some folks brewed special teas after intimacy, made from nettles, chamomile, and blessed clover, said to restore chastity, like a spiritual reset button. In one French village, a local priest added wine to the mix, possibly to help with confessions. You sit by the hearth with a warm brick at your feet and ask whether love was ever simple in this world. The washerwoman shrugs, stirring her kettle. Simple's just the word people use when they forget the awkward parts. As twilight thickens, she recounts the tale of a man who bathed in holy water every time he sinned carnally, not dipped bathed, fully submerged. The monks finally locked the font after he clogged the drain with beard hair and regret. You nod politely, sip a nettle infusion that tastes like boiled barn, and wonder if he ever felt clean again. Outside, the trees rustle as if in laughter. A red ribbon flutters from a bush, left, perhaps, by a couple who believed tying a knot near running water would dissolve guilt. Or maybe they just got caught and ran. You tuck the story away and make for the main path. Your shoes squelch through dew, and the last of the washerwoman's smoke curls behind you like a ribbon of incense. Medieval purification rituals weren't just about hygiene or holiness. They were about managing anxiety, turning lust into ritual, guilt into gestures, and love into something that could maybe, just maybe, be forgiven by morning. As the stars blink overhead, you hear the creak of a cottage bed somewhere in the dark, followed by a long sigh, and then the unmistakable slosh of someone pouring water into a basin. A ritual begins, or ends. You keep walking. You wander farther now, toward the outskirts where the old abbey looms. Its high windows stare blankly over the woods like a monk deep in thought, or deep in denial. This was once a sacred site, but as with all things medieval, sacredness was negotiable after dark. Tonight's subject, clerical celibacy, or the surprisingly frequent lack thereof. Officially, the church insisted that priests maintain chastity, but in reality, things got a bit foggy. A mainstream historical fact. By the 12th century, the church had issued numerous decrees banning priests from marriage or cohabitation, yet thousands of records from the period speak of housekeepers who mysteriously bore the priest's nose and chin. You enter the abbey's side garden, where herbs grow wild: sage, yarrow, feverfew. In the corner stands a statue of Saint Agnes, her marble eyes watching over a world she likely wouldn't recognize. A cloaked figure passes by, Brother Remigius, a fictional monk with an unfortunately real problem. You follow his steps through the echoing halls as he tucks a folded letter into the hem of a tapestry. Love letter? Possibly. Confession? Perhaps. Most likely both. Fringe tidbit: certain monks were caught constructing secret passageways between their cloisters and local cottages. Not for theological outreach, but for late-night outreach of another kind. One abbot in Burgundy reportedly bribed carpenters to add a trapdoor beneath the sacristy. The door led not to the wine cellar, but to a mistress named Colette. Historians still argue whether these stories were exaggerated by rival factions or simply whispered truths. Either way, the number of papal edicts addressing concubinary priests, suggests it wasn't all rumor. In fact, some clergy even left whilst naming their nieces. As heirs, nieces born suspiciously close to the rectory. Inside the abbey, you find a book chained to a lectern, a penitential manual. Its pages, thick and uneven, list punishments for everything from impure thoughts during matins to excessive gazing upon women's hair. For that offense, one could be sent to fast in a cave for 2 weeks with a blindfold. You move on, past candlelit corridors lined with tapestries depicting saints. One image shows Saint Jerome with a lion, though the lion seems far more interested in a peasant girl bending to draw water. In the abbey's rear cloister, a small door leads to the quiet room, a place where monks could reflect. But the scratches on the doorframe suggest reflection often included visitors. Someone carved a heart into the wood, alongside the initials B+H. Love, it seems, always finds its margin. You peek through a lattice window into the garden again, and notice a priest pressing a flower between the pages of a psalter. Not a daisy, but a marigold, symbol of grief, yes, but also desire. He whispers something in Latin that might be prayer or poetry. Another oddity: certain monasteries trained young boys in music by promising that singing high notes would keep their minds untroubled. Some monks believed that celibacy could be strengthened through pitch. Not entirely wrong, just acoustically ambitious. Outside, a nun's habit swishes past. She doesn't look surprised to see you. In fact, she tips her head in greeting, her lips pressed to hide a smile. You recall the tale of Sister Marjorie, who claimed the Holy Spirit spoke to her nightly through the stable boy. Bold interpretation of Scripture, really. As midnight tolls from the Abbey Bell Tower, you feel the weight of centuries clinging to the stone like ivy. All these rules, all these breaches, and all the penance that followed. But the truth is, love didn't avoid the Abbey. It simply knocked softly, entered sideways, and borrowed someone's robe. You step back into the night, where the wind flutters your cloak, and the moon paints silver halos around mossy headstones. Somewhere above, angels might be sighing, or snickering. You wander into the village square, where gossip sticks to the walls like wet laundry and secrets pass hands faster than loaves of bread. Here in the heart of the town, love becomes performance. Its stage a wooden cart, its props a tankard, a wink, and someone else's spouse. This chapter, medieval adultery, and the wildly creative ways it was punished. Let's begin with the basics. Adultery was a sin, a crime, and in some towns, a very public spectacle. A mainstream historical fact in parts of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Suspected adulterers were forced to walk through the streets wearing humiliating garments, horned hats, backwards tunics, or even literal stalks of garlic hung around their necks. You pause near a bakery stall where an old woman sells sweet buns dusted in cinnamon. She nods knowingly, perhaps remembering the tale of her great aunt, who once eloped with a lute player and ended up scrubbing the abbey floor for 10 years. A fringe tidbit. Some towns used shame masks, iron cages shaped like animal faces, fitted over the head of the guilty. There was a pig mask for gluttons, a donkey for gossips, and for adulterers, a goat, naturally, allegedly for its virile reputation, though the goat community has yet to comment. Historians still argue whether these punishments were more moral theater than actual deterrence, but judging by how often the same villagers appeared in court records, let's just say that lessons were rarely learned the first time. You pass a faded mural painted on the town hall, a man kneeling before a crowd, his trousers around his ankles, while his wife stands beside him holding. Is that a leak? Yes. Turns out, in parts of Bohemia, an unfaithful man had to publicly recite a poem of apology while clutching a leak between his legs. Symbolism, you suppose, is rarely subtle. On the next corner, a blacksmith hammers away while his apprentice sneaks glances at a red-haired girl selling eggs. Romance blooms even amid the clang of iron. You recall the tale of Sir Edric and Lady Marwyn, he with a roving eye, she with a well-placed ledger. Legend has it she caught him in a tryst, then charged both lovers rent for using the guest bedroom. But not all adultery was punished. Nobles had their own rules, mostly unwritten, mostly ignored. Some lords kept mistresses in tower rooms and wrote them bad poetry. Some queens, in turn, favored handsome courtiers with more wit than lineage. The court of a leaner of Aquitaine, for instance, was a hotbed of romantic experimentation, though no one dared put it quite that way on parchment. Even among the common folk, love triangles formed like barn cats, unexpectedly, and often loudly. Medieval songs tell of milkmaids who lured shepherds away with butter pats, and innkeepers who fell for their ale suppliers. You can almost hear the lute twanging in the distance. And what of reconciliation? Well, some communities offered curious solutions. In Italy, one tradition called for a husband to forgive his wife by dancing with her in the town square, wearing her apron, apology and humiliation, all in one twirl. You step into a side alley where vines creep along the stone, and a painted sign hangs crookedly above. House of the Dove. Likely a former brothel. The door is shut now, but you can imagine the laughter once trapped inside, the whispered excuses, the not-so-secret meetings. Back on the main road, a juggler tosses apples in the air. A child claps. A man steals a kiss behind a hay cart. Romance, as ever, does not wait for rules. It bends them, giggles behind them, then runs barefoot into the dusk. And you walk on, more curious than scandalized, more amused than shocked, because in a world where even chastity belts had keys passed around at weddings, nothing stays hidden for long, especially not love. You continue through the winding alleyways of the medieval town, where every crooked, timbered house seems to eavesdrop on your footsteps. There's mischief in the thatched air tonight, the kind whispered behind church pews, and scribbled into the margins of confession scrolls. Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval aphrodisiacs, where love potions weren't just real, they were sometimes edible. You stop beside a wooden stall draped in dried herbs and peculiar powders. The vendor, a woman with wild hair and sharper elbows, leans in and whispers, "For desire fennel seed, goat fat, and a dash of powdered stag antler." You blink. That sounds less like a potion and more like something scraped off a tavern floor. Still, a mainstream historical fact. Herbal love remedies were widespread in medieval Europe, from the leech books of Anglo-Saxon England to the medical texts of Salerno. Aphrodisiacs were brewed, boiled, and boldly swallowed. Cinnamon, aniseed, ginger, and even carrots were prized for their warming, stimulating properties. The strange part, it wasn't just the hopeful who drank these. There are records of priests secretly using herbs to test the strength of temptation. One German bishop reportedly claimed a basil tonic gave him visions of Eve, though historians still argue whether this referred to the biblical one or the blacksmith's daughter down the lane. A fringe tidbit: the Spanish fly, made from crushed blister beetles, was believed to increase arousal. Trouble was, it also caused violent stomach cramps and occasionally death. But you know, romance is risk. You wander past a moonlit garden where young apothecaries pluck nettle and yarrow, giggling as they pocket a few red poppy petals for luck. You imagine the awkward medieval dates that followed, one partner overdosing on clove wine, the other waiting nervously with a bouquet of parsley and pickled eggs. In medieval love culture, there was an odd belief that sympathetic magic worked best when the potion included a piece of the beloved, a lock of hair, a bitten apple, even nail clippings steeped in goat's milk. Yes, love was sometimes crunchy, and should that fail, one might turn to amulets, tiny pouches worn around the neck or thigh, filled with crushed gemstones, bat blood, or verses from erotic poetry. Some were sewn into corsets. Others were tucked into codpieces. The goal was the same: heightened attraction, increased stamina, and hopefully no fleas. You pass by a stable, its horses dozing. A young groom sits nearby, reading by candlelight. His book, a well-thumbed copy of the Secretum Secretorum, a medieval text rumored to hold the recipe of Cleopatra's kiss. Historians still argue whether such a section ever existed, but the rumor alone kept the manuscript in steady circulation. Around the corner, you find a couple nestled behind barrels of ale. The man holds a small phial, the woman a suspiciously bright red pear. They glance at you and laugh, as if to say, "Don't knock it till you've tried it." Meanwhile, over in the abbey kitchens, a monk quietly stirs a pot of saffron, muttering a prayer and adding a spoonful of honey for joy, he says. For joy in moderation. Because even the church, with all its finger-wagging, occasionally admitted that love had its potions, just not too many, and never on Fridays. As you walk on, you note the irony. In an age when sex was so tightly regulated, desire still slipped through the cracks. It simmered in soups. It danced in candles. It glowed faintly in nettle wine served under a willow tree. You smile. Maybe you'll ask the herb seller for her recipe. Just not the one with the beetles. You move through quieter streets now, the hour growing late. The town slumbers, mostly. But your path leads you toward a final and peculiar chapter in the medieval love story. Trial by sex and other divine tests of purity. Yes, you heard that right. Sometimes the truth came out not in court, but in the bedroom, or more awkwardly, in its aftermath. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. In some regions of medieval Europe, especially under canon law or in folk traditions, trials of fidelity and chastity were less about evidence and more about superstition. If a woman was accused of adultery or premarital sex, she might be made to carry hot iron, drink cursed water, or wait for it, sit on a fertility stone to prove her innocence. If she bled, bruised, or winced too loudly, well, let's just say the verdict wasn't in her favor. And then there's the notorious trial by ordeal, where a woman suspected of infidelity would have to walk a certain distance barefoot or unclothed to prove her purity. Historians still argue whether these trials were symbolic rituals or actually enforced punishments, but the anxiety they caused was undoubtedly real. You step into the town's old chapel. The candles have burned low, but the scent of wax and frankincense lingers. Here, whispered behind altar cloths, was another form of truth-seeking, the church's fascination with impure dreams. If a man dreamt of a woman too often, some confessors believed it was a sign she had bewitched him. Imagine trying to explain that to your spiritual advisor. It wasn't me, Father. It was the dream sorcery again. Quirky tidbit time. In a few French villages, if a newly married couple didn't produce children within a year, the neighbors were allowed to gather outside their house, bang pots, and chant helpful reminders like "try again." It was called charivari, equal parts harassment and medieval fertility encouragement. Even kings weren't immune to these beliefs. One tale tells of a noble lord whose marriage was said to be cursed because he'd stolen a kiss from a nun. His household employed a full-time relic bearer whose job was to carry around a holy finger bone to neutralize lust. Sounds like a fun role at dinner parties. You pass a well in the square where, according to local gossip, love spells were whispered into the water. One spell required a woman to circle the well 3 times, then toss in a sprig of mint while naming her secret crush aloud. If bubbles rose, he'd love her back. If not, she had to shave her eyebrows. Harsh. Still, not every ritual was meant to shame. Some were simply strange and sweet. Lovers would exchange binding knots, ribbons tied in complex patterns and worn under clothing, believed to tether hearts together across great distances. If your beloved sneezed while you tied one, extra good luck. And then there's the bed blessing. Before consummation, some couples would invite a priest or a local elder, depending on how devout or desperate they were, to bless the marital bed. This could include sprinkling holy water on the sheets, lighting protective candles, and in more rural areas, placing a clove of garlic under each corner of the mattress. Love, apparently, smelled faintly of soup. As you round the final corner, you spot a window left open, curtains fluttering gently in the breeze. Behind it, two silhouettes, perhaps newlyweds, move quietly, their laughter soft as rain. Outside, hanging from the doorknob, a woven charm shaped like a key. A signal, perhaps, to keep away or to listen closely. And with that, your midnight stroll through the intimate eccentricities of medieval desire draws to a close. The night deepens now, and the sounds of the town fall still. Just the soft hush of leaves against the shutters and a sleepy owl overhead. You imagine yourself back in that candlelit alley, wandering beneath the same stars that watched lovers centuries ago. Let your thoughts quiet. Let the laughter fade into the background. The peculiar herbs, the whispered chants, the awkward trials, all fade like mist over the hills. You carry only the warmth of those strange, human efforts to love, to connect, to dream. Breathe slowly. Let the parchment-colored world of the past soften and dissolve. With every breath, imagine flickering torches going out, one by one, until only a gentle hush remains. You're safe, you're still, and you've made it through one of history's strangest bedtime tales. Sleep well.